Hello and welcome to The View from Felaban. I'm talking to Steve Donovan, who is the head of Treasury and Trade Solutions for Latin America at Citi. Steve, thank you for joining me.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So you oversee a division that looks at a variety of financing products, including more longer-term products such as infrastructure.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about what we can expect from 2018, and really it's going to be the year of politics, isn't it?
Yeah, correct. I think it's very much a year of politics if we're talking about Latin America specifically. We have significant elections on the horizon in Brazil, in Mexico, in Colombia. We have elections in Chile actually in the coming days and weeks. And, on the one hand, that's a big opportunity for the region. On the other hand, there's some inherent risk depending on the outcome of some of these elections.
So really could really turn one way or another next year, which will make a big difference for banks such as Citi, which have a big presence across the region.
Potentially, absolutely. If you take a country like Brazil, for example, where a much needed and tough reform agenda is in the various phases of being executed, a return to a more populist led government carries the risk of really unwinding a lot of that reform agenda that's currently in various stages of execution right now. That would hamper, in my opinion, the future growth prospects of a country like Brazil that's just emerged from a very, very deep recession. We've seen the positive outcomes of elections in countries like Argentina that again emerged from very deep recession, have implemented very unpopular economic and social reform agendas, but have started returning to growth. Whilst inflation's still high, the fundamentals, I think, for a continued improving environment, attracting a lot more foreign direct investment into countries like Argentina is very real.
And depending on how elections go, we will also see different environments when it comes to infrastructure financing, whether the private sector involvement may be more or less required.
No, absolutely.
And there is such a big need for infrastructure development in Latin America. So the estimates we're talking earlier, trying to pin down a figure, so $100 to $200 billion.
I would say, the estimates that we were discussing earlier, I'd say it was closer to $200 billion if you're looking at the entire region. Which is an exciting prospect, but these big infrastructure projects require funding. So, governments increasingly now are going into, different forms of capital markets, financing opportunities, as well as working more closely with the private sector.
So some governments are updating or even creating from scratch PPP laws, public-private partnerships laws, and the banks also revisiting the way that they finance these projects.
Yeah. I think you've seen the banks, I think it's safe to say the last few years the banks have moved away from financing transactions that have tenors of 15, 20, 25 years. They're more focused on 5 to 10 year financing. And we more closely engaged in kind of the pre-construction and post-construction phase of these various projects as well. But there's a significant role for the international banks to continue to play, and we'll continue to be relevant in that space on the right transactions as well.
What would you like to see in those markets looking to progress with their infrastructure works? So legal certainty is often one of the issues mentioned by international investors and finances. So, and if with the major reforms go ahead in some of the markets, we mentioned that would help the situation. Are you hopeful that this will happen?
I'm a very optimistic person by nature, and I'm very optimistic it will happen,
Okay.
And you've got bright spots in the region as well. Peru continues to be a bright spot in terms of growth. You've got countries like Paraguay that continue, small economies, but continue to outperform. Notwithstanding some of the challenges in Colombia, I think depending on how the elections go in Colombia is another, potentially bright spot for us if you look at the next 2 to 3 years as well. I think the outlook is fairly positive. What we used to consider to be the norm across Latin America, which was growth of 7-8%, driven primarily by the commodities boom. The new 7 or 8% is probably 2.5 to 3%. As we look to 2018 and beyond, but there is growth. There's subdued growth the last 2 or 3 years, but there's growth, and I think that growth will be sustained.
And despite an initial rise in interest rates elsewhere in the world, I think it would be fair to assume that institutional investors, international investors, will still be seeking yields which they can find
absolutely
in markets such as Latin America.
In the emerging markets, yeah. So, I mean, you've got, again, there's been subdued growth in the developed economies, but there's a return and a sustained return to, albeit modest growth in the majority of the European markets. Domestic demand in China is very, very strong. And whilst there's been an adjustment of sorts in overall GDP in economies like China, it's still pretty strong growth. And of course in North America, close to home, we expect at least one more hike in interest rates this year. And then, people vary on whether there's going to be one hike or 3 hikes going into 18. But consumption is strong. Unemployment is declining, and I think all the signs are that the recovery in North America is sustainable as well. So
fundamentals are improving.
The fundamentals, I think, are okay. Yeah, I mean, the biggest risk, if we're talking outside of Latin America, where we've talked about the pure political and somewhat economic agenda, is the geopolitical risks around the rest of the world. If you look at the Middle East and the potential tensions between countries like Saudi Arabia and Lebanon right now, and Iran, down to North Korea.
Yeah.
You can talk about Brexit and what's the likely impact or fallout of Brexit, and I think time will tell. And I don't think we'll really fully be able to expertly state what the impact positively or negatively, most likely the latter, for the UK will be, for a few years yet. And the same is true of NAFTA. I mean, NAFTA,
that's right.
The renegotiations on the NAFTA agreements, I don't know where that's going to end up. I'm optimistic they'll arrive at the right position. But again, the short-term impacts of any renegotiation, I don't think are going to be felt too noticeably. I think it's a medium to longer term play.
So quite a lot of question marks, but compared to other parts of the world, perhaps Latin America at this stage still offers risks which are maybe more manageable than than elsewhere.
Yes.
And hopefully
opportunities.
And opportunities which hopefully finances and investors will take up, particularly when it comes to infrastructure.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for your comments.
No problem. Thank you.